Okay, well, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Naomi Velasquez. I live in Pocatello, Idaho, and we're here to learn about and explore image transfers today. I'm always learning about image transfers. There are a lot of variables, so I find that really exciting, but it can make some of the processes interesting on some days and different on others. So we'll talk a fair amount about troubleshooting and trying to figure things out. So what I'd like to do is show you some cool stuff. I just want to talk a little bit about the overview and kind of the high level view of what we're looking at today. So I want to first talk to you about what sheets are on the website for you. I'm going to show them to you. I don't intend for you to read them from my document camera, but I do want to show you what documents are available to you. So I'm going to share my screen for a second here. Okay. Just going to show you this view here. All right. So the first sheet that you have on the website is an outline of our class today. So we're actually going to break it up into some types of image transfers in the morning and then others in the afternoon. What I think is really important about this sheet is this is my kind of reference sheet for which types of transfers work for which types of images. And so for me, that's really important to understand which types of transfers work with which type of imagery, because not all of them work with each other. Okay. The next sheet is just a resource guide, and that is some books that I'm about to show you. I love books and I love buying books and making books. So I always have a library full of things. So I'm just going to show you some books that I have that I think are helpful. And at the bottom, you can see I just have some common places to buy supplies. And then the last one is actually the supply list, and it's more dedicated to specific links for what we're going to need today. Instead of just like generalized websites. So it should drill down a little further on what you might need. Okay, if you guys have questions about these, just let me know. Okay, so I'd like to show you some of these cool books. So I'm just going to start showing them to you. So when I'm looking at my resource pile, this one is called Playing with Image Transfers by Courtney Cerruti. And this is a beautiful book. It does have a lot of projects in it. I tend to gravitate more towards books with techniques instead of projects because I have plenty of ideas for projects, more than I can accomplish before I die. But Courtney's book is beautiful. It has a bunch of pages about how to use specific imagery and transfers. It's a great book. I like all the step-by-step diagrams and pictures. Okay, and that one's on your resource sheet. I also have this one. So if you're someone who's interested in doing image transfers on fabric and not just paper, this is a great resource. It's not just for image transfers, it's really for a whole range of resources like cyanotypes, digital fabric printing and things like that. This one is extremely detailed and has a bunch of images of finished work.
Cool.
So that's Imagery on Fabric by Jean Ray Laurie. The next one has been one of my favorites for years. I have multiple copies because I keep lending them to students and they come back to me at various times. So I have a bunch of copies of this one. This is called Image Transfer Workshop, Mixed Media Techniques for Successful Transfers. And this is by two authors. You can see it down at the bottom, Darlene Olivia McElroy and Sandra Duran Wilson. This one is great. It has about 50 types of image transfer processes. Not all of these have been successful for me. The ones I've chosen to teach you today are the ones that I can get consistent results with. So there are many in this book that you are welcome to try and you might just really love. Okay. So this team of artists and authors also has another book, and it is called Surface Treatment Workshop, Explore 45 Mixed Media Techniques. So this is kind of an additional book that they've created recently. And this one has some great images of finished work with image transfers, and it has really great images and pictures about different properties and some other things to explore. Okay, I told you I had a big pile. I'm not out yet. So I also have this book called The Collage Workbook. And this book is just great if you're thinking about, what do I do with image transfers? You know, how am I going to incorporate these? And I think this book by Randall Plowman has some really great images. And it has some really great ideas for incorporating image transfers into collage. Okay. And then I think that is all my technique books. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Okay, so that's my stack of technique books. There are more on the market, but these are my absolute favorites. Okay, so what I'd like to also talk to you about is the supply list. I'm going to talk about the supplies for the entire class today and not just for each specific technique, because many of them are shared. I have it separated on your supply list based on what you would need specifically in addition for each image transfer type. Okay, so I'm just going to go through the list in the order that's on the supply list. So the first thing that you need is copyright free, if you're going to sell the work at all, laser printed black and white images. So where do you get those and how do you acquire them? My best advice is that fresh copies work best. And I know that seems silly, but I date mine. So when I print them out, I actually write the date that I printed them on the sheet. And I write where I printed them, because when we talk about troubleshooting, that's a major issue. So let me just screen share again. So this sheet right here, you can see this is a black and white laser copy, and I just wrote notes on the bottom that I printed this one this morning. So I know how fresh it is and I know which printer I printed it on. So I tried some on my copier at work from last week, and the toner is just not quite right and they're not transferring beautifully. So that's one of my major troubleshooting tips, is that the printer you're using might be your problem. Okay, so this sheet is from an awesome resource called Crap Hound, which is an awesome name. The author of this book is Sean Citrasolv, and he's actually in Washington. And these aren't necessarily all 100% copyright free, but what they are is fascinating and wonderful. So I have my skull apron on today. So skulls are kind of an obsession of mine. So this is one of the volumes I chose to buy, where he has bunches and bunches of skulls.
Okay.
And then scissors. So he also has a bunch of scissors and telephone imagery. So most of these are old enough that they're copyright free, but not necessarily all of them. So that's just for your information. These are some images that I have. I do love black and white images because they are the most archival. So we'll talk about that in just a second.
Light. I'm done.
All right. So the other thing you're going to need is magazine images. You can choose to use magazine images. I think they're great because they're extremely exciting. They have lots of colors in them. They're beautifully composed. Color copy images are also available to you. So I've got an example here. Finding color images that are copyright free is most easily done on the internet, quite honestly. So if you search for copyright free images on the internet, you'll find a bunch. You can also use your own. So magazine images could be just cool things that you find.
Don't worry, Jim, it's being included.
And then color copies could be things you find other books.
Jim, I'll wash up a few things, including your bowl. Don't worry.
You guys can mute yourselves if you're not muted. That would help. Thank you. So this guy is an example. Has these copyright-free images. A lot of Dover publications will be copyright-free images. So this is a whole set of illustrated alphabets. So I've copied some of these for us to use today for demos. They're just beautiful images of letters.
Oh, you're bringing.
Next on your supply list is background papers for practicing transfers. So I like to use a mix of patterned papers and colored papers to kind of see what works. There are some image transfer techniques that will bleed the background image. So just be aware that sometimes it may affect what's happening on the back of your image. Okay. A small pan or a container with warm water for immersing and rubbing off paper. So I'm just using a shoebox today, which I'll show you once we get to that. I think that a clear one's easier to see for demos, but you guys can use whatever you want. It can just be a dollar store bucket with warm water in it. The reason why I'm using a bucket and not just doing it in the sink is because we're gonna actually rub off paper and I don't want it to clog anybody's pipes or make a mess. Okay, next thing is a bone folder for burnishing images. I'm sure you guys have thousands of bone folders like I do. I have a Teflon one that I really love because it's really easy to get the solvents off of it when we're done. But you could just use a standard bone folder or the handy dandy plastic ones that are on the market now too. So you can see that I've labeled these with washi tape. I can't seem to get my name to stay on them with anything else. So I put washi tape on them when I take them to workshops so that I know which one is mine. Okay, sandpaper. So I'm using a sandpaper today. That is 120 grit. We're going to use this to rub off the back of transfers when we're trying to remove the paper. So you could use anything. This is like 100 grit. I just don't think it's as easy to use. This is from the dollar store. I'm using a heavier duty one from our household sandpaper supply. I live in a 100-year-old house, so we have lots of house projects and lots of sandpaper. Okay, the spray bottle is optional. I actually prefer taking off my image transfers in the bucket of warm water instead of the spray bottle, but some people don't have access to a bucket of warm water when they're doing this all the time. So you're welcome to use a spray bottle instead. So Lynn just asked what grit. It's really whatever grit you want, but this one that I've got right here is 120 grit. So this purple one is 120 grit. Thanks, Lynn. Okay, so those are the generalized supplies for most transfers. Let me show you the specific supplies for the individual techniques we're going to cover. So the first technique is Citrasolv transfers. So this is Citrasolv. It's just a natural cleaner and degreaser that you would find on the cleaning supply aisle at your grocery store or hardware store. I think this is the most up-to-date bottle. I have some old ones in my office that are still good that we bought maybe 10 years ago and they're fine. It's a very, very concentrated cleaner. And if I get a little closer, you can kind of see better. It's just a cleaner that's orange flavored and it smells great. So this is the one I like to use in classroom settings because it has proved to be the least offensive to all students in terms of breathing and other kinds of complications. Okay, packing tape. Oh, sorry, I skipped cotton balls. I think you guys don't know what cotton balls are, but here they are. These are my dollar store cotton balls we're going to use today. Okay, packing tape. It can really be any brand of packing tape. You might find a really wide roll that allows you to not double it up to do a large image transfer. So I've got this roll. I also have some slightly thinner packing tape. I haven't really found a brand that doesn't work. They've all been fine for me, no matter where I get them. Okay, we already talked about magazine images. I also use wax paper for this technique. So when you do a packing tape transfer, you're essentially clearing off the image and leaving the residue of the imagery on the packing tape. And so I just lay them on wax paper when I'm done with them before I'm ready to place them on a collage or in a book project. So they just kind of stay on the wax paper until I'm ready to use them. And I'm a big fan of the dollar store. We're always looking for inexpensive supplies for our students. So dollar store wax paper is fine. Okay, so solvent transfers, I'm going to try to remember to use the word solvent transfers. This also means xylene transfers. So you can use one of two things for these transfers. You can use the actual marker, or you can use xylene. So I'm going to grab the jar, it's giant. So this is xylene or xylol. You can get this at the hardware store. So this is the solvent that we're using for solvent transfers. Okay. It's in the paint thinner section on the aisle where painting supplies would be. And then the marker, I've already lost. Here it is. I prefer the marker, but they dry out and they run out and you want to have a backup plan. So I use the xylol or xylene. So this is just a chart pack blender marker. It's clear. It just says chart pack blender P-0201. It's just a blender marker. It's used for Prismacolors and other chart pack markers to blend colors together. So you can see it just has a clear tip. And this is the chemical that is xylene or xylol. I really like using this as the applicator, but the big jar is useful if you're doing a big transfer. So this is great for tiny ones. Okay, I'll try not to lose that again. That one is a specialty product. So I like to list specialty products and where you can get them locally. So I live in a small town. We don't even have a Target. So it's really difficult to find art supplies for us locally. So it's easy for me to buy a jar of xylol at the hardware store, but it's harder for me to get one of these. I have to order it online from Dick Blick or Jerry's Artorama. Okay, acetone transfers. Acetone in any form. I really like the 90 to 100%. And then this is what you can buy at the hardware store, is a heavy duty cleanup acetone. You could use the acetone that you use to take off fingernail polish, but some I think work better than others in terms of their percentage. So I think 90 to 100% is the best way to go. Okay, gesso transfers are super fun. I use just a regular old basic acrylic gesso. This is from the one art supply store we have in town, Hobby Lobby. So this is just acrylic gesso. It could be any brand of gesso. None of them seem to be different than the others for transfer methods. I'm going to flip over our page. You will need a paintbrush for the gesso transfers. I will, I'm sure during today's class, do it with my fingers and forget and then have to go wash my hands. It's much better if you actually use a paintbrush. I forget and just like start rubbing it in with my fingers and then I have to go wash my hands. So a paintbrush is great. These are really inexpensive dollar store paintbrushes. They have a plastic tip. You can also use foam brushes. So we're just talking a regular standard 50-cent foam brush. Any of that's fine for applying the gesso. And then for that transfer method, you want very thick paper because that transfer method gets wet. So watercolor paper, letterpress printing paper, really heavy duty book papers are really wonderful because they can withstand being immersed in water. Okay. And then the optional items are a heat gun for drying things quickly. So I'm both type A and impulsive, which makes for a unique combination. So I want to do things and I want them to work, but I want to do it quickly and I want to do it when I care about doing it. So for me, a heat gun is ideal. So some transfer methods need some drying time, like the gesso transfers. So just a little craft hobby heat gun is great because you can go ahead and dry your transfer and use it very soon instead of waiting overnight to let it dry before you can actually use the transfer. So this is just my little craft hobby heat gun. You could use a heavy dutier one. I think this is a little safer because it doesn't get quite as hot. A hair dryer is not really hot enough. You actually would want a heat gun. Okay, so that's optional. The xylene is optional. If you just want to use a chart pack blender, that's fine. The next optional item is matte or gloss gel medium or glue to adhere packing tape transfers. So right here I have some matte medium. So it doesn't really matter what brand. This is just a golden soft gel gloss medium. This is a Liquitex matte gel medium. These can be used to actually adhere your packing tape transfers, and these are clear. So then you can actually see through the packing tape to your image below. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the last item on the supply list that's optional, and I'm going to talk about archival qualities at the same time. So this last item is this guy. So this is a Krylon UV resistant spray. This is a clear acrylic coating. I chose the matte version. It could be any version. I'm always thinking about how can I balance the archival nature of the project and also make something that I really want to make. And so for some of these image transfer methods, they don't have a really high archival quality, which means if I sell them to someone, then they might not last forever. And so I'm always trying to kind of mitigate that issue. So if you were to spray your images with this UV resistant clear spray, it's going to improve the archival quality of your project. Usually several coats are suggested. You could spray the whole thing when you're done before it gets framed or mounted or however you're using it, or you can actually spray the image first as well, and that's been suggested to improve the archival quality as well. So let me just show you one more page in another book. So in this book, Image Transfer Workshop, Darlene and Sandra have a great page. It's page 8. So this guy right here, page 8. It lists all the transfer methods and kind of their archival quality. So I choose generally to use copier or toner prints because their archival quality is the highest, because those have a foreseeable future that will probably last until I die. So that's these images. Of a more medium archival quality will be magazine images and toner color copies. So those are a little lower generally, so you might use the UV spray for those. And then kind of the least archival quality is inkjet prints that aren't printed on like a really good surface. So those are in the very bottom category. So if you have questions about that, let me know. But basically, I just want you to kind of think about it. This spray can really, I feel like I'm a product advertiser today, but I think this spray can really help make sure that your images stay clear and don't fade over time. Okay. Stop me if you guys have questions. Okay. The next thing I want to tell you about is paper versus fabric. So I'm going to show you several things today. I'm going to talk about and show you sample images from each category of image transfers. They can all be done really on fabric or paper, but I think some of them work better on fabric. So in my experience, Citrasolv has worked the best on fabric. And so I'm just going to show you an image of that right now, if I can, on the screen. So let me just share my screen and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So here is my desktop, which is messy. I apologize. So we'll just show you this image right here. So this guy right here is a piece, a quilt that I did. And if you can see, I'm going to use my cursor to show you. The Citrasolv transfer image is this map that I've got here, and then I embroidered on top of it. So you can kind of see some areas where there's a heavier pattern, a thinner line pattern. So this is Citrasolv on some vintage and new textiles. So I was able to do it on top of an image that had already been fabric painted, like these green and yellow areas are fabric paint. So I was able to do the Citrasolv transfer on top of the fabric. Okay. So that one has tended to be the best option for fabric for me, but you can use the others, and I encourage you to experiment with them. I certainly have used matte medium and gesso to transfer onto fabric, and that's been great. So the important things about fabric transfers are to wash your fabric first. Again, I'm impulsive and I always want to start the project as soon as I have the fabric, but take the time to wash it and remove all the chemicals that are in it. Do not use fabric softener. And then you're going to heat set it when you're done. So I do think it's important to use an iron to heat set your transfers after you're completed. The last tip I have for fabric is to tape it down. So fabric is wiggly. Paper, I think, has a certain strength to it and it doesn't want to move while you're doing an image transfer, but fabric wants to wiggle. And so I tape it down with some painter's tape. This is just a yellow roll of it. It's often blue. We call it blue tape at school, but this is what I use to tape it down so that the fabric doesn't move while I'm doing the transfer. Okay. Safety and ventilation. I have my fan going right now. I have an air purifier in here. So I have it running so that my air quality is a little better. But I'm going to open my windows when I do the solvent transfers and the acetone transfers, because I think those are the ones that require the most ventilation. You're welcome to wear a mask. When I teach them in the classroom, we open all the windows and turn on all the fans to make sure that nobody ends up having a breathing problem. Okay. The other thing about acetone is that it will remove finishes off many things. So if you've ever spilled nail polish remover, you know that it could take the finish right off anything. So I use a specific cutting board to remind myself. I leave notes for myself in the world. So this says used for acetone. I try to keep it simple. So I use this when I do acetone transfers. So I'm not going to get it on my wood finish table or other things in my studio. So this is just a little dollar store cutting mat. So I always use it for my acetone transfers. Okay. I think we're getting to the end of my intro list here. Just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. Okay, so uses. So let's talk about why you might use image transfers. There are a billion uses in the world. You might want to transfer images onto pieces of wood. When our printmaking instructor last week, and he installed an exhibition of images that he had used solvent or xylene to transfer onto a bunch of small pieces of wood, and they were arranged in a landscape. It's lovely. You can use them for books, for collage, for mixed media, for fabric, for embroidery. I personally have tried using them for sashiko. So I'm always struggling with how to transfer images to fabric that I then want to go away. So I ended up using an image transfer to print onto some sashiko patterns, and then I stitched on top of them so it covered it up. So you can actually use it to print onto fabric and then stitch on top of it. Altered books. So I'm just going to show you my altered book example. Maybe. Here it is. So this is where I made some examples and samples of image transfers, but you can use them in altered books very easily. The only one you have to be careful about is the one where we're using matte medium, where we'd have to get the pages wet. So in a physical altered book, that one is not very conducive to this process, but you could do it and then glue it in. Okay. All right, I'm going to show you one more troubleshooting page. So in the imagery on fabric book on page 19, they have this cool list, and we're going to talk about these informally as we go through the demos today. So this page has troubleshooting for solvent transfers. So the idea is it says, what's your problem and what's your solution? So basically, there are lots of problems with image transfers and there's lots of solutions. So for example, my problem is a runny looking print on my fabric. The solution, use less solvent, right? So you want to think about what's happening and what you can do to fix it. The problem is a pale print or a loss of detail. The solution is use a darker or fresher copy, right? So we're going to talk about those things as I show you examples today of how they did or did not go well. But I just want to let you know that there are resources that can kind of help you figure out what's going wrong. Okay, so I'm just going to look at my list again and make sure we're good. We talked about archival qualities and safety. Those are the most important. And the last thing I have on my list is that I would encourage you to embrace the imperfection. So some of these transfers are never going to be perfect, and I like them for what they are. I like that they don't transfer exactly, because if I wanted something that transferred exactly, I wouldn't be a letterpress printer. I wouldn't try all these things that are never perfect, right? Like, I'm interested in the imperfection and making it look like it was made by a person. So I would encourage you to have fun, enjoy the process, but embrace the imperfection. Okay. All right. So it is 10:34 my time, different wherever you guys are. And so I want to go ahead and move on to showing you the first image transfer technique. So if you have questions, now would be a great time before we get started with the first one. So go ahead and hop in the chat or turn on your mics if you have a question. Anybody?
I have a question about the Citrasolv.
Yes.
It looked diluted, but it does come full strength.
This is not diluted. This
okay.
is full strength. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yep, I have not diluted it at all. That's a great question. I use it straight out of the bottle, just as it comes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And could you show again and spell that bone after you do this one?
Which one?
Could you spell the thing in the beginning that was white? It was like a marker and you called it a bone something?
So I have this chart pack.
Not that one.
Okay.
Earlier than that, in the very beginning, that. Yes. What is that again?
So this is a bone folder that's made of a different substance.
Could you spell it, please, or put it in the chat? Bone folder?
Yes.
I've never, oh, BONEFOLDER. Okay, bone folder.
They're made of bone. So basically, that's the way that they've always been made. And certainly we have lots of artists in the book industry who make their own. I think that Shanna Leno's bone folders made from old fans and other vintage objects are just so beautiful. But this one is specifically made from a different material. So I like this one because it resists, the Teflon resists other types of things.
And where do you get those?
You can get them from small bookmaking suppliers like Colophon Book Arts, I think might have some Teflon bone folders right now, but I'll look that up and I can put that in our question and answer session this afternoon.
Thank you.
Of course. Those are great questions. What else? Okay. I'm always trying to walk the line between trying to give you information and not assuming that you know everything, but also not bore you if you already have a lot of information about book arts. So, all right. So the first transfer I want to start off with is looking at the solvent transfers or xylene. So that's going to be with the chart pack blender marker or the xylene from a can. So I'm going to try to clear off my space a little because I've already made a disaster of my area here. So I'm going to show you my examples first. So I'm all categorized little folders. I keep these in a binder so I can always find them for classes. So these are my xylene transfers. I'm going to turn on my document camera so I can show them to you. So I've already got some made, and then I'm going to physically do them for you to show you how the process works. So I'll just share my screen. Oh, and I lost my, I just love it when my document camera decides not to be a part of my life. It just gets very angry. So let me just go back here. Okay. I'm going to share my desktop to show you my document camera. There you go. Okay. Can you guys see my folder that says solvent xylene? Yes? Great. Okay. So here are some examples of solvent transfers. Some good, some bad, some ugly. I like to show you the ones that don't go well. I keep everything because I don't actually want to just have good transfers, because it can show you some of the problems if you keep all of your transfer samples. So I'll just start one at a time. So here we have a brand new copy using a copy that I sprayed with UV spray and used xylene. And I was using a font or type that was not reversed. And so when I used it for this transfer, it became reversed. So that's my first lesson, is that if you're going to use text, you need to reverse it before you transfer it for many of these methods. Okay. This is using an old copy with xylene. It had a little bit of problems with some of the image because the copy was old, and so the toner wouldn't lift off of the paper. Okay. This skull right here is a xylene image that I transferred, and I didn't let it dry at all. And I'll show you what that means in a second, before I put it down on the paper, so then it bled everywhere. Okay. This is a xylene copy that I did on top of a piece of paper that had an ink pad print on it. So it didn't blur that at all. The ink stayed good. And I just used the blender marker for that little skull. Here's a xylene transfer on a cotton fabric. So you can see, I think the resolution's pretty good. I'm going to get this one a little closer to the camera. I think the resolution's pretty good. It was a pretty thick line drawing of like an Art Deco image. Okay. This is a vintage piece of paper. I don't want to say vintage. It's 1986 vintage. Let's not call that vintage. This is an old piece of paper that was created when I was in middle school. And it had some typewriter printing that was already copied onto the sheet. And then this is the transfer image. I think it looks like they go all together. I used xylene from my can with a cotton ball with a very fresh copy, and I burnished it well. And I still like that it's not totally perfect. You can see some of the lines aren't totally perfect, but that's what I like about it. Okay. Here is a color copy. So this was actually a piece of chocolate, but it was on a piece of paper. There was a color copy, and I used a chart pack blender marker to transfer this. Okay. And here's one showing another troubleshooting challenge. This was a xylene image that I let dry too long. And so then it didn't want to transfer. It got all smudgy and blurry because I kept lifting it up and looking at it and putting it back down. And then it never did copyright because I waited too long. So this is kind of an imminent process. As soon as you put the solvent on, you want to make the transfer. So don't answer a text in the middle because it's not going to work out. So this is our texting example. Don't text and transfer. Okay, so here's a xylene image. It worked great with an old copy. Look at that beautiful detail. It's on a paper bag from the grocery store, but it turned out great. So the old copy in this case worked just fine. Okay, and then this one, I just want to show you this. This is just a quick aside about fabric. I've seen suggestions of people telling me that these would transfer well by just using my iron to transfer them, and I can never get it to work. So you're welcome to experiment with that, but I don't find that using an iron to heat set things has really worked out for me. So you can see that they're blurry. When you put the iron on, it tends to dry it immediately. And so I just don't find that that's a great solution for me. I use the iron to heat set it after I've completed the transfer. So these are just samples that reminded me to tell you that that's an option. I've just never gotten it to work for me. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second and see if you guys have any questions before I show you these transfers in real life. Do you have any questions?
Naomi, there was a request to maybe expand your document camera screen.
Oh, okay, make it bigger. Okay,
Yes, please.
sure. You bet. I can do that. All right, I will do that before I show you these transfers. I'm gonna lift up here. Okay, here we go. Okay, so let me see if I make it a little taller. Move it out a little. Should show a little bit more of the screen. If that's not better, you guys let me know, but we'll try that for now. Just gonna move my light too. I had it in that original place trying to reduce shadows, so we'll try this. Okay, so what I'd like to show you is some xylene transfers. I'm gonna grab my Start Pack blender, my Teflon bone folder. I have the xylene in a can. I'm gonna grab some cotton balls. We're gonna use those. I probably only need one. It saturates the cotton ball and it lasts for a long time. And I'm gonna grab a background paper and a copy. So I've prepared some background papers here. I'll just grab some. I'll show you how they work. Okay, so let's grab some paper and some transfers, and I'll show you the different kinds that we discussed. So I'll show you one of each. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with a black and white image. So we'll start with some scissors. So I'm using scissors that I use for paper. You can use whichever scissors you would like to cut your scissor image. Okay, so I'm gonna pick this big guy because I want to show you a big one. And we'll use the blender first just to show you the marker. So this image will be reversed. So I'm using an image that I expect to reverse when I lay it down. Okay, just move these out of the way so you can see. So here's my black and white toner image, and I've got my bone folder handy, my blender handy, and that's really all that I'm going to need for this one. So I'm going to go ahead and take my image, open up my blender marker. I've got my ventilation going, and I can smell it already. So I'm going to go ahead and color on the solvent onto this image so you can see what changes on the image. So I'm coloring on the back. And for this one, I can go ahead and lay it down and lay the solvent onto the copy while it's on the background paper. And I'm going to set this down and use my burnishing tool to burnish the image. Okay. This is a long transfer, so it may be blurring because I didn't tape it down. We'll find out in a second here. So you can see it's not quite where I want it to be. I'm going to add some more solvent and continue burnishing. I want it to be a little darker. I'm just burnishing the image. Now move my fingers carefully to the center and continue burnishing. Okay, so I'm going to close my marker now. It's really hard for me to close it in the middle. I never have enough fingers or hands. So this is on a textured paper. So you can see that my image is not completely dark, but I really like that texture because this is a This is a Letra paper, I think, from Nina, and it has a really heavy texture and I use it for letterpress printing. So part of this texture is the paper and not just the image transfer. Okay, so that's one version. Interrupt me if you guys have questions because I have my document camera on and I can't see the chat. Okay. So let me show you on a different image, and I want to show you what the difference is when you use the Xylol from a can with a cotton ball as compared to the chart pad blender marker. I'm just going to open this guy up and put some on this cotton ball. And I'm going to use that fancy acetone cutting board that I have to lay down my cotton ball so I don't get Xylol or xylene everywhere while I'm waiting to transfer my image. I'm just gonna saturate my cotton ball. And when I'm done with these, I take the trash out so it's not sitting in my house, so that I don't have the fumes continuing to come away from my trash can. This is the Xylol. I'm going to move that out of the way.
Naomi, this is Molly. Do you ever wear a mask, a face mask, while you're using these solutions?
I absolutely do. I'm not going to today because you guys won't be able to hear me, but I definitely use a mask at school, and I also have a ventilation system. So I definitely recommend wearing a mask. Okay, so I have my burnishing tool. That's a great question. I have my Xylol on a cotton ball, and then I'm going to grab a copy. I'm going to grab one from the same sheet to kind of show you what happens from the same type of copy with the two different ways to apply it. Because this one I actually have to be a little more patient with.
Do you recommend some particular copiers because of the toner that you need? Do you see a difference?
I recommend trying it. So I recommend, it seems like a waste of time, but it's not. I recommend trying a transfer from a specific copier before you like commit to like a whole edition or something crazy, where you're gonna commit to like a lot of books where you have the same image over and over again, because you just never know which copier is gonna work well or not.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, of course. That's a great question. And I will say that our copier at work is really old, and typically it's left a lot of residue of the toner on the pages. And so it's historically been a great thing to use. And then just this week I tried it and it wasn't in great shape and it just didn't work very well. So you just kind of have to keep trying it. Okay, so I'm going to grab.
Naomi, quick question.
Yeah, of course.
What was the name of that paper that you used?
This one right here.
The textured one, yes.
I think, you know what, I might have to look that up for later, but I'm looking at the box in my studio. I think this is a Nina. I think this is a Nina paper. It's a letterpress paper, but let me get the name for you.
Okay, we can add that to the Q&A at the end.
Yes, but I'm gonna write that down real fast so I don't forget. Because we've already got two questions. So the Nina paper, and if you guys remember what the other question was, somebody asked that I said I'd answer later, I will get back to that. Okay, so I've got a piece of paper, I've got a map that I've prepared with acrylic and gesso. And then I've got a black and white laser copy. I've got my bone folder and I've got the Xylol on a cotton ball. So I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm kind of leaving a white space here because I need to have a place to put my fingers. I do think that's important. So if I were to cut up all my images and not leave any space around them, like for example, this one I was holding it right here, I think that it doesn't work as well. I think you need a place to hold it that doesn't have the toner touching your hand. Okay, so this guy, I'm gonna apply the solvent. You can see it's going on very heavily because it was very saturated, but I'm gonna try to turn this in the light so you can see it's shiny, but I want it to dry a teeny amount before I actually put it down on the paper so it doesn't just mush around everywhere and become completely blurry. So now I'm going to try to burnish it to the paper. And I can see that some of the toner is escaping, so it was still a little too wet. So this is not going to be a totally great transfer, but it's a good demo example. I'm just burnishing. Lift it up. You can see that it's doing well, but I do have a blurry spot right here because I just waited not quite long enough. Always impatient. All right, so I'm going to lift this off and show you. I'm going to move it up to the camera. So you can see I've got that blurry spot on the top right corner of the scissors because it was a little bit too saturated with solvent when I made the transfer.
And how did you prepare that paper?
This paper, I write little notes to myself. I put some acrylic paint and gesso on the paper. Okay. It's kind of a common altered book technique. Yes, sir.
Any general guidance on color of paper to use?
I love color and I love texture and pattern and layers. And so I'm always thinking about how can I add an image transfer to something else to provide color and contrast. So I think that color is totally a personal choice, but I do think that it makes it really exciting and fun.
Is it possible to transfer onto darker colors?
It is, and I'll try that. I'll show you today. We'll try a darker color and I can show you what happens. I think that, you know, it just has a different feel to it. Here, let's try a darker green one. So you can kind of see that. Does that answer the question, Mark?
I think so. Do you apply the gesso to keep the solvent from saturating?
I don't specifically, but in an altered book, I'm often working with old books. So let me show you an example. I'm often working with old paper. And so if I didn't prepare the page with gesso, it's possible that it would saturate right into the paper and I wouldn't be able to see it because the paper has a different kind of absorbency in an old book or an old vintage paper. So I've got gesso on these pages so that it would accept ink more readily. The transfers, I don't think you have to have it to accept the ink, but I do think it helps. For example, on this one, I put gesso on the paper first, and then I did a Citrasolv transfer so that I'd be able to see the contrast of the image versus the text underneath. So that's really more what I'm thinking about is reading the image than accepting the transfer. That help a little? Yeah, great. Thanks for asking questions. So I'll just try one on a slightly darker piece of paper. I'll do another one with that solvent before I go put it outside so it doesn't make me stop breathing. So here, I'll try this little skull guy. See if we can get it to work a little better on a dark piece of paper. So I'm just gonna lay out my tools again. I've got the xylene, the burnishing tool, a background paper, and an image with a lot of white space for my fingers. I'm just gonna put a little xylene on there. You see it dripped on my paper this time. And I'm just waiting for it to change. It was a little shiny. I'm waiting for it to not be so shiny. You can see it drying there. I can get a reflection there. Just making it a little less shiny before I put it down. It's not quite there yet. I'm trying to be patient before I burnish it to the paper. Just air it out a little. You can see on the correct side of the image that the toner will raise off of the copy. You can kind of see it lift. You can kind of see it lifting there, which is what I want it to do. Okay. So we'll try it on this darker image. I'm just burnishing whichever part of the bone folder or tool you think burnishes best is great. I'm gonna burnish a little more. You can see I keep checking it just to make sure it's doing what I want it to do. Okay, there he is. That turned out beautifully because I was patient and I waited. for the xylene to not be quite so wet before I actually tried to transfer it. And that's on top of acrylic paint. Okay. So let me go to our list and see what other things I wanted to show you, because I already buried myself under a pile of papers. So if we look at the solvent transfer, I noted on our sheet, I'm going to put this in front of the document camera for a second, that for solvent transfers, you can use toner-based images and color copies. So now I'd like to show you a color copy solvent transfer. I'm going to use those letters we talked about so we can talk about reversal of images.
What kind of tape do you use to secure the image?
I use a low tack tape, so whatever that means for you. So for my example, I would use this low tack tape. It's a masking tape. This says it's not for painting purposes in the middle, but that's typically what people use it for, is putting on tape to prevent paint from getting on walls. And as artists, we've started using it for a lot of things because it doesn't leave a residue behind when we're done and it removes easily. So I'm not using regular masking tape, I'm using a painter's type tape, otherwise called a low tack tape.
I have a question about your color copy.
Sure.
Is it a laser color copy?
It is a laser color copy.
And do inkjet color copies work in this same method?
You're gonna wanna test them because every printer ink is different. So I'm talking about a color copy that I get that's from a laser printer at like a professional copy shop.
Okay, thank you.
That's what I'm using, yeah. And that's a great question because you'll wanna test it with your printer. We can't seem to keep ink cartridges in stock at our home printer. So I never have an inkjet print to test it with. I don't know, the other people in my house keep using it. So I never have one of those to test. So I just buy mine at the copy shop and bring them home and use those. I have a pile of transfers here. I just wanted to point out while they're here in front of me that these are now used up. I'm not going to use these again. So unlike some printing methods where you can use ghost prints and other things, I've used the actual toner on these. So I'm going to recycle them or throw them away. Okay, so I'm gonna grab my color copy that I just made at the copy shop of a reversed letter. And I threw him on the ground, so here he is. Okay. I want to find my reverse letters so I can show you. So I've got, don't you love the letter X because it's reversible? So we won't use an X, I'll use a different one. But I love the letter X because it's beautiful. I'm going to use the last letter of my last name. So I'm going to use the Z. So what I've done is I asked the copy shop to print it backwards. You can also go ahead and reverse the image in Photoshop or other editing programs. You can flip it horizontally so that you can make sure that there's no confusion about the fact that you wanted it reversed. So work with your local copy shop and make it work for you. So I've got a Z that's reversed. So you're seeing the reverse image. So the idea is that when I lay it down to do my image transfer, it's going to copy the right direction. And if you have questions about that, let me know, because reversal and upside down printing and letterpress, it's always exciting. So I'm just going to cut out a Z. I can make it work. So again, I'm going to leave some space on this. So for today's example, I'm going to leave some of those lines on the paper. You can see that. So I've got a reversed Z and just some lines on the paper and then a finger hold for myself. Let me go ahead and do this on a white piece of paper. Okay, so I'm going to use the Chart Pack blender marker. I've got my burnishing tool handy. I'm going to pick it up and I'm just going to color on my image. to hopefully release that color. I did not test these this morning, so we'll see how they do. Okay. I'm just gonna try to burnish this color copy. It is working, but I don't have enough toner or enough solvent on there. So I'm gonna add some more. And I'm gonna burnish this one fairly heavily because I noticed that it's getting a texture or pattern from exactly where I burnished it. So I'm gonna really go over it with a lot of pressure. Okay, so there you can see, I'll lift it up. Here is my original image. And then reversed, now the Z faces the correct way. So there's the color copy image. You can do this for whole words, whole phrases. You can put this in an altered book or a book project. All the text that you want. My students use this quite frequently because it's kind of a really low tech method that they don't have to have access to special printers or presses or other types of equipment.
I know you showed it at the beginning of the session, but what is the title and who are the authors of that book of illuminated letters?
Oh, sure. No, I actually didn't show you all my books. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. And then I wanna show you some more examples of where to get images from, just because that's a great question and I forgot to address it. Let me just show you what I've got here. So this guy, this is Owen Jones. This is 1,000 Illuminated Letters. This is a Dover publication, and Dover is something we always used as kids. They made a bunch of coloring books and paper dolls and all sorts of things. So this one specifically has like an alphabet page for every single letter. Okay, that's by Owen Jones. This one I also have in my collection, but this is all black and white images. So this is an Art Nouveau collection. This is motifs and vignettes. I just always look at secondhand or thrift stores trying to find images. I think part of the fun about image transfer is finding images. You can make your own and color copy them. You can make a watercolor image, an acrylic painting, make a color copy of it, and then transfer it onto something else. Here's an old one called Art Nouveau Borders by Ted Minton. This one I've had for like maybe 2 decades. It's an encyclopedia of the Crystal Palace exhibition. So it's totally copyright free because it's so old. It's all black and white images, but they have an incredible amount of detail. They're quite lovely, like all sorts of crazy things in here. Okay. And then I did show you the Crap Pound. This one isn't necessarily copyright free, but is really beautiful, and you can buy it at buyolympia.com. If you don't know them, it's a great organization.
And that book you just showed,
Yeah.
Do you then copy the page or can you use it directly from?
I always copy the page because I don't know how this was printed. So I actually scan mine in on my iPhone. So if you have a new iPhone, it has a cool function where if you go into the notes feature, you try to take a picture and it'll say, do you want to scan documents? And so then it scans it for me and makes a good amount of color contrast so I can use it as a scan. A great question. Okay, here's the last one. So this one I just got. Go ahead.
Are the images copyrighted in Crap Hound?
So that's the thing. I have it to show you because I do love the artist. I love Sean. He's very clear about the fact that not all of these are copyright free. Because I'm so obsessed with skulls, I actually know that some of them are copyright free because I've used them and I've gotten them off of sources that are copyright free. So this guy is not necessarily copyright free. So I use them with caution. I'm just using them for demos today because I love this book. But if you're gonna sell work, I wouldn't really recommend it. Just because I'm overly cautious and teaching high school students, I have to teach them to be a little overly cautious.
And should color copies be fresh, just like the black and white ones?
I have not had the same problems with those. So I've used old color copies that have been great. But it's, for me, specifically the black and white toner images that if they're old, the toner doesn't tend to lift off the paper as readily. It kind of gets like set in its ways and it doesn't want to leave the paper anymore. But I haven't had the same problem with color copies. Okay, I'm gonna show you one more book and I'm gonna answer the questions that are in the chat. So this is called The Complete Encyclopedia of Illustration. It's all copyright free. It's by J.G. Heck. And I just want to show you a couple of pages in it. It has maps and images of people going to war and field fortification. This is a beautiful book. And so it has really lots of great diagrams that I would scan in and reverse before I printed them. Okay, I think that's my stack of books here. So I just want to answer some questions in the chat before we move on to the other transfer methods. So let me just scroll up a little bit. We talked about low-tack tape. Linda Marshall says she has some Dover books that she'd like to pass on, which would be great. Color copies do not need to be as fresh as the black and white images. Jeannie shared that Android functions can scan as well. I just find it to be really useful. I don't carry a scanner around with me, but I do carry a cell phone. So I'm always available to take pictures and scans of things. Lynn asked if I take in a thumb drive with the image or copy my scanned image. It depends on your copy shop. Personally, I use the one that we have on campus. So I will just email them the images that I've prepared and ask them to print them out on the color copier for me. But you can do whatever you need to do with your personal copy shop. Great. And somebody already checked out Sean at buyolympia.com. I'm just gonna write buyolympia.com in there. If you don't know it, it's a great place to buy stuff from artists in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. Lynn also asked, how do you apply the gesso to keep the solvent from saturating? So right now I'm using xylene. That's the transfer I just showed. I think that the best way to apply it without making it saturated is to use the chart pack blender marker. It seems to give you the correct amount of solvent. It's not too much and not too little, right? It's the perfect Goldilocks solution for the xylene transfer. Okay, other questions before I show you the gesso images?
Can you scan in and reverse? Can you just say it one more time? Scan in, reverse, and scan in and reverse before printing. Could you just, since I haven't done it, could you just repeat the steps?
You bet. So I use Photoshop, which is what I'm familiar with. I know that it costs money. I use it for work all the time, and so I have it available to me. In Photoshop, if you have an image, you can specifically flip the orientation horizontally, which reverses it. In every image editing program, you should have some type of option where you can reverse the image. The command might be a different name. Again, I'm working with Photoshop, so that's what I'm familiar with. However, there are copy shops and printers and other places where you can actually choose it as a function to reverse the image horizontally, and then you can just do it at the copier or at the copy shop.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
I hope
you.
that helps. So every digital editing program is a little bit different, and I'm just familiar with Photoshop. So
Thank you.
of course, other questions before I show you gesso transfers? All right. I hope you guys are excited to go and get a chart pack marker and try it. Okay, so let's move on to gesso transfers. If you have more questions, I can certainly answer them this afternoon or when I'm done showing you these gesso transfers. So let me grab my set of sample images for gesso. So we are here. I'm going to turn on my document camera again so that you can see what I'm doing, but I'm going to go through my acetone in a closed trash can in the other room before we do that, because it's, or my xylol because it's smelly. Okay, now I'll be able to breathe. So let me turn on my document camera. Okay, so I'm going to show you what these gesso transfers look like when they're done. And I've also pre-prepared some because this is the transfer method where it needs some drying time. So I want to show you what I've got, and then I'll show you some I've already prepped, and then I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so I have a giant stack of these because I think I really love this method. I have like a bunch of them. So I want to show you what I've got here. Okay. So here is a piece of paper that I letterpress printed for another project. And then I stamped on it with some ink pads. I applied gesso on top, which made, if I turn this paper a little in the camera, it made the gesso turn a little bit pink. So I took a little bit of the ink and smushed it around when I put the gesso on. And then I did a black and white transfer on top of it. This is a piece of watercolor paper that was very old, and I put the gesso on top and it didn't make the watercolors bleed at all. And then I put a color copy image that I transferred on top. So it's a piece of chocolate from a chocolate box. Here is one of my bad examples that I kept to remind me what not to do. This is a gesso transfer on fabric. This is some just cotton fabric that I pre-washed. I put gesso down on the fabric and I put a magazine image on top, but I didn't burnish it well enough. And so when it started to dry, it crinkled. So it crinkled right where this line is right there. And the paper stopped attaching to the fabric. And so when it dried, I had this hilarious line left in the middle. So it didn't transfer in that one spot. So I keep that one to remind me to make sure it's flat. Here is another piece of fabric with gesso on it. You can see the white gesso here, and I've transferred a black and white image on top of it. This one I wanted to experiment a week ago or so with what would happen with a paper that's not really meant to get wet with this image transfer technique. So I used a paper bag, and you can see it crinkled up the paper bag, but I still got it to work and it didn't destroy the paper bag. It just has a different texture now. So instead of using watercolor paper, I tried a paper bag, and you can see that it left some texture on the paper. Okay. Here's another old letterpress print that I had. I put some gesso on top, and this is a magazine image. So you can see it was a bug and a flower, and it kind of has a ghost-like or shadowy kind of feel to it. I really like it. Here's another image to remind me to talk to you guys about reversing imagery. So I used an image that had the text the correct way and put it down on the paper, so now it's reversed. This was also on top of a watercolor image that did not decide to bleed. So you kind of have to just test things like your backgrounds to see if they're going to work or not. So here's one that did not work as well. This is watercolor that was very fresh. And when I put the matte medium on, you can see it just made a mess of the watercolor and it just smeared it around. But the image transfer worked great on top of that gesso. So this is a black and white toner image.
Do you use the white gesso or clear gesso, or have you ever used the black gesso?
I haven't used black gesso because I'm usually using images that would not show up on a black gesso. But if you mixed black and white, then you'd have a nice gray. And then I'll show you the clear in just a second here.
Okay.
Yeah, great question.
What is the point there of the gesso?
I'm about to show you with the technique. The gesso actually makes the transfer happen. It acts as the kind of solvent
Ah,
or chemical that actually makes it happen.
I see.
Good question. This is actually matte medium instead of gesso, and it's clear. So if I tilt it in the light, you can see that it does have a shinier texture to it, but it's clear on the back of the paper, and this is with a magazine image. So sometimes I want to color or tint the background. So this I used a mixture of acrylic paint and gesso to get a red color, and then I transferred a black and white toner image on top of it. Okay, just a couple more and then I'll show you the technique. So this guy, again, is a letterpress image on the background that I wanted to layer over, and this was a magazine image using some matte gel medium. This one didn't turn out quite as well. I don't think that I spent as much time rubbing off the image in the bucket of water. Okay, so I have one more gesso and magazine image. This one I rubbed too hard and I destroyed some of the image, so I was a little too aggressive. So I lost some of the image, but again, it kind of looks like a vintage photograph from my grandmother's photo albums, which I kind of like. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second and make sure you guys don't have any other questions before I show you the technique. Hello again. Okay, so let me show you some images and show you how to do this. So this will hopefully explain to you what the point of using the gesso on this image is. So I'm going to do this technique. I am, again, going to choose a paper that's going to work for this technique. So in this case, I'm going to use a watercolor paper. So I'm going to grab a piece of watercolor paper because it can then stand up to the fact that I'm going to get it wet in a minute. So let's grab a piece of watercolor paper here. Okay, so watercolor paper, and then I'm just going to start off by showing you a black and white image, and then I'll show you a color one. So we'll try a black and white image from the pile here. I think we'll use an anatomy image here. So this I printed on my laser printer earlier this week, and it's not reversed. So we'll pick an image that will reverse. Okay. So basically what you need for this technique is your gesso. So again, this is just generic acrylic gesso. A burnishing tool. I like the Teflon one because I can wash it off after I'm done. And then a paintbrush. And in my case, I'm going to grab a tray so I can set my paintbrush down and not get it on my table. So I want to be able to set my paintbrush down and go ahead and work with the transfer while it's still wet. Okay, so I'm just going to put the gesso directly on the paper. And I'm going to smear it around with the paintbrush. This is the part where often I'll do it with my fingers and then I have to go wash my hands. So I'm just going to use a paintbrush so it's not messy. And I'll put my paintbrush on my tray. I'm going to lay down my image. You can see I don't actually need a finger hold on this. I could actually cut it more directly. So because of this transfer method, I don't need to hold it. So I'm going to cut down my image like this. So it's just right around the image and I'm not getting a lot of white extra paper around the edges. Okay, so I'm just going to lay it on the wet gesso and let it sit there for a second And then I'm gonna burnish it down. So I'm just making sure that it's attaching or adhering to the background everywhere so it can dry like that. So I'm being a little gentle. If I move this up to the camera, it's white on white today. The gesso is kind of spilling out the edges of the transfer. And that's okay. It's still gonna work. I'm just burnishing it down, making sure it's touching in all the places. Okay, so at this point, I'm just gonna clean off my bone folder. At this point, it needs to dry, or you can use a heat gun to dry it. So then you can actually remove the backing paper and expose the transfer. So I'm gonna let this dry, but I'm gonna show you my kitchen prep example that I already let dry, and I'll show you how to process the rest of the image with a different transfer. Okay, so here, I've already prepared one. I put paint and gesso on a background watercolor paper, and I've got a black and white image, which I let dry. I did this a couple of days ago, so it's just been sitting and waiting in my studio. So the next step is to take some sandpaper and abrade the back of it just a little bit. Grabbing my sandpaper. So I'm just gonna rough up the surface just a little. Just so it'll come off. That's it. It doesn't require much. I'm just really kind of telling the paper that I don't want it to stay there. Okay. So now I'm gonna grab my bucket of now cold water. It was warm, now it's cold. And we're gonna immerse our image in the water. So you can see it better in this white, this clear bucket here. So I'm just gonna put it in the water. You can kind of actually already see the image. You just saw it show up now that I got it wet. And then I'm going to gently just rub off that backing paper with my thumb. So you can see why watercolor paper would be good for this one, because it can handle the agitation and being immersed in water. You can see how much paper I'm taking off floating in the water. That's why I don't want to do this just under a sink, because it'll clog up our sink. And probably yours too. So I'm just gently trying not to be too aggressive. Just gently rubbing it off. So I want to show you what it looks like at this moment. So right now it looks fine, but if I touch it, I can still feel paper that will rub off. So I actually want to spend a little more time rubbing off some more so that I get a clearer image and it's not all cloudy. This is kind of meditative, right? I'm just rubbing the paper. And I'm just waiting for it to feel like I don't have paper rolling up underneath my finger. So that is my completed image. You can see it's a beautiful transfer. You can see the color of the paint and gesso beneath this black and white image. So I see the light blue behind it. So it's a nice way to layer an image with some opacity difference behind it. And then I would let it dry or use a heat gun to dry it.
Do you mix the paint and the gesso, or apply paint then gesso?
Oh, that's a good question. I just squirted both of them on the piece of paper and brushed them on together. So I just like attacked the paper with all sorts of things. So, you know, feel free to play with it and experiment. Yeah. Okay. So I just mixed them together just because I didn't want it to be tinted just white. I thought it'd be easier, which it is, in this lighting to see something with a little bit of color on it. So you can just use white though, and that's fine. So I'm going to put this on my ironing board to dry here. Okay, so you can see how much paper bits I have left in the water, I strain this before I wash the water down, so I'm not sending this all down the sink. You can tell we have like clogging issues, so I'm really cautious about sending stuff down our drains. Okay, so let me show you another one. So this one was a magazine image. And I'm not sure how this one's gonna work out because I letterpress printed on this piece of paper. It's an old offcut from a project when I had a different last name. You can see a little bit of Adams there. So it's really old, but I'm not sure that the ink is gonna be stable. So I put a magazine image down on here. So we'll just go ahead and try to rub this one and get it off and we'll see how it does. I'm just putting it in the water.
Is it possible to use the image on color paper and leave a small amount of paper left to cloud the image?
Yes, definitely. I've done it accidentally, right? So you can definitely leave some paper on it to cloud it so that it looks kind of fuzzy and maybe a little dreamlike. It's a filter, right? Makes us look not as wrinkly if we leave a little bit of cloud on top of our image, right? Okay, so I didn't put sandpaper on this one before I threw it in the water and it's not coming off. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now because I forgot that step. So always a good demo, helps you remember what to do. So I'm just gonna apply some sandpaper. Otherwise, I'm not sure this is gonna come off. Okay, so now I've applied sandpaper and now I can feel it wanting to remove itself from the paper.
Is it possible to use this technique in an altered book and use a wet cotton ball to remove the paper?
I haven't had much success with that. When I've done this technique, I've instead chosen to glue it in once I'm done with the transfer. That's a great question. So in altered books, I tend to use the other types of transfers. So xylene, Citrasolv, or acetone, and those have worked better in altered books. Great question. I'll show you my altered book. I think we'll have time at the end of this session today to show you some examples that I have in my altered book. Okay, so I just want to show you how it's going and then I'll keep working on it. So here's the magazine image. It was an image of an illustration of some people maybe in the 20s. So it's a beautiful color image. You can see that it's a little cloudy right here. I still have some white magazine paper showing, so I'll just rub it a little more. And then we'll let this one dry. So you'll be able to see it dry in this afternoon's session. So that'll be in the recording if you can't come this afternoon. Okay. So actually my ink did okay from the old letterpress print. It's not really running. It looks just fine. These are just things that I would encourage you to test if you're going to use them for projects. So here's my magazine image that I had applied on gesso on a pre-printed paper. So this is letterpress printing and actually a screen print too. So both of them have survived the process.
When you say magazine image,
Yes,
do you mean any old magazine?
I do. Yep. I mean, I just cut it out of a magazine and threw it on the paper.
Right.
So this is just a magazine image. You can see the back of it. It was maybe a birding magazine that someone gave me that we found at school. This is the other side of it. It's got this cool kid holding a big fish.
But the paper itself doesn't look like magazine paper. To me, it looks thicker.
Shiny. It's glossy and shiny, and it's got that kind of like clay feel to it. Yeah, it's just regular old magazine paper.
Okay.
They're actually really pretty sturdy and they make really nice copies. The thing to remember about the magazine images is that according to the things that I've researched, they're not maybe as archival.
Right.
Okay, great questions. Okay, so I'm going to show you one more pre-prepared image and then I'll show you a couple more images of how to apply these again. So this is just a canson paper, a textured pastel paper that I used for a letterpress print project. And I put some gesso on top and a color copy image. So I'm going to put some sandpaper on it. So don't forget that stuff this time.
Just confirming that the image will be reversed, correct?
Yes, this is definitely reversed. So basically, if we're talking about reversal of images, the only one that I'm going to show you today where it will not be reversed is the packing tape transfer. So we'll do that this afternoon. So that is completely as you see it, as it goes. But all the rest of these, it will be reversed. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so I put some sandpaper on it. Now I've got it in my lake of water here. You guys can see my lake of water. So I've got it on this paper, and this was a color copy from that italicized letter set. I'm just rubbing it off. Sandpaper helped the paper release. So now we've done a black and white copier image, a magazine image, and then this is a color laser copy image. You can see it turned out really nicely. I didn't really lose any resolution. It reversed the image. And the printing underneath the paper seemed to hold up pretty well. So this paper is a little thinner. You can see it's wrinkling a bit. So I actually might go and iron this paper dry just because I want it to lay really flat. Just gonna get the rest of the bits off here. Looks like I was a bit messier with the gesso on this one, so I got bits of gesso all over the corners. Okay, so let me just show you a couple more before I show you the altered book sample. So I'm just gonna move my tray out of the way. So I'll show you one of those magazine images so we can let it dry by this afternoon. And so we'll try this magazine image of books. Seems topically appropriate. And we'll apply it to a surface. So I think I'll show you applying it to a watercolor paper that I've already got some paint on. We'll try that as an example. So I've already got some acrylic paint, and then I stamped an image with gesso on top of it. So now I'm going to apply some gesso to this paper, and we'll apply this magazine image and let it dry for this afternoon. So I'm going to grab back my gesso right here. So I've got a burnishing tool, a brush, some gesso, and then my magazine image that I'm going to use to transfer. And I think, you know what, we'll add some acrylic to make it fun. So I think we'll add some Naomi green acrylic paint to the mix. My students have labeled this acidic green as my color because I use it for everything. So. All right, I'm just going to shake up my acrylic paint. Any acrylic paint is fine. It can be inexpensive. This was on clearance for 97 cents. Anything is fine. Okay, so I'm just going to squish on. I'm going to test it over my bucket here. Sometimes it leaks out water first. I'm just going to put some acrylic paint on. That was satisfying. And some gesso. You could just use acrylic paint, but I really think the gesso helps it adhere. Okay, we'll just put some over in this corner of this image here.
Does this technique work with a photocopied photograph or images from book pages?
Say it again, Mark. From which?
From a photocopied photograph or images from book pages?
It works with a photocopied photograph, and then images from book pages, unless they're a laser copy or you made a color copy of them, I don't think they're going to work because the ink isn't going to release. So I would make a copy of that book page image, if that makes sense. And if you guys have specific things you're thinking about, let me know. I'll show you a photocopy of a photograph in just a second. We'll do that one next. Okay, so I've got my color laid down. It's fairly opaque. I've got my magazine image. Oop, and my paint isn't quite big enough, so I'm just making it a little bigger. And then I'm just going to lay it down right there. You can see the back of that magazine page text is just sitting there. I'm just going to tamp it down a little bit and then I will burnish it. If you don't want to get your burnisher messy, you can always use a little wax paper. In between your burnishing tool and your image, because this one is fairly messy. You can always use a little bit of wax paper to protect your tool. Okay. I'm just making sure this stays really well. I want to show you a fabric one too, but we have time. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of this wax paper. You can see that I have burnished this image upside down with the image that I want to be left there is facing the paper on top of an existing image, and I used acrylic paint and gesso. So I'll show you the result of this afternoon. Okay, so I just want to address the copy of a photograph question. So look at my grandma. Isn't she beautiful? She's so gorgeous. My mom recently did a Storyworth project where she made a whole book full of like all these memories. If you guys haven't done it before, I encourage you to do it for your families or encourage your loved ones to do it for your family. So basically it was a bunch of interview questions and she included all these pictures all year long. And so now I have this treasure trove of images of my grandparents, some of which I hadn't even seen before. So this image is a color copy of a photograph. It will transfer beautifully with the matte medium. I've also used it with black and white copies of photographs that will transfer beautifully with this technique. I have another family portrait here. This whole color copy would transfer with the gesso. That would be great. Really bright saturated things are great with matte medium. So all of these would work with this process. Okay, so I've shown you magazine, color copy. I didn't show you a color copy. Let me show you a color copy real fast. What do we have drying? We have a magazine image drying. Oh, and a color copy drying, so I'll show you black and white. So here's an image. This is not reversed. So I'm not going to use the text in an image. I'd like to use one where either the text is reversed or I can just use the image. So I'll just cut ex libris off the bottom of this. So this is from my art copier that was not working very well, but for this technique, it doesn't really have to be a fresh copy. It's more for the solvent transfers and the Citrasolv. So here's a lovely lady. We'll just transfer her using some matte medium and a fresh paintbrush. I'll show you with a foam paintbrush, and I think I'll show you with the gesso instead of the matte medium. I'm sorry, with the matte medium instead of the gesso, so you can see what it looks like with a clear one. So we'll do that for this afternoon as well. Okay, so I'm using just this gel medium. It's by Liquitex, but it could be anything. Okay. So this guy, it looks opaque if I put it in front of the camera, but it's actually going to dry clear. And so I'm just going to put it on my paper and use it instead of the gesso. So when I say a gesso transfer, I'm really being kind of like inclusive of acrylic paint, gesso, and matte medium, or any combination thereof. Okay, so this is gonna dry clear. So that's why I wanted to show you this one. Move it up into the camera view. Gonna lay my image down, upside down, and just burnish it. And then I'll show you a piece of fabric, and then I think we'll be ready to show you that altered look and wrap up for this morning. Jump in if you guys have questions while I'm burnishing here. I'm just trying to get all the air bubbles out. This is a piece of watercolor paper. Use the side of it because it's kind of making some bumps. So use the side of it to make sure it's really nice and flat. Okay. Now our lady reading a book will just dry and we'll see her this afternoon. I'm just smoothing up the matte medium around the edges. Okay, there's that one prepared. So now I'd like to show you on a piece of fabric, but I'm gonna use a piece of fabric that is cotton and pre-washed. So I will just cut off a piece of this pre-washed fabric. We'll put an image transfer on here. Okay, so that's just some cotton fabric. I have washed it. It's got a little bit of lint on it. So I'm just going to use the opaque acrylic gesso for this. I'm going to get a different paintbrush. And then I think I will show you with a color copy. So we'll use a piece of this copyright-free image I got offline from an artist who generously shared his work with us. So I'll just cut off a piece of it. This one can be any shape, so we'll just make it an unusual shape for this one. So you don't think that everything has to be rectangular. Okay. So I'm just going to put down the gesso. So for this one, I am going to use a piece of low tack tape to hold it in place while I apply the image. And I might let it dry there until this afternoon. You could use cardboard or something else, but I'm going to use this cutting mat that I have.
Naomi, quick question.
Yeah.
Going back to the matte medium,
Yes.
can you mix it with acrylic paint so that it doesn't lighten the color like it does with gesso?
Sure. Oh, yeah. So any of these guys, the gesso, the matte medium, the acrylic paint, they can all be mixed together in any which way that you want. So this guy I've taped down my fabric because of that example I showed you where it got wet and it didn't adhere correctly in that center stripe. So I'm trying to avoid that. So I'm taping it down with low tack tape, and I've got my color copy image, and I'm going to use gesso to apply it. I'm just squirting it on there. Paint it around a little. I could paint it in a specific shape, anything I want. You can see the fabric's more absorbent than the paper, so I'm going to have to put a little more on. Okay, so I just laid down my color copy upside down. Now you can't see it because it's all white on white on white. So my color copy is laid down there. There you can see it if I tilted it that angle. So you can see I've got my color copy laid down on my gesso on my fabric, and now I will burnish it.
Do the color copies have to be laser for this method too? Or can you use a printer, a home printer?
Sure, I would encourage you to try it. My experience is with commercial color printers that are laser printed, but I would say just try it. It's worth one copy, right? To go ahead and try it. All right, great question. So I'm just burnishing this. making sure it lays flat. And I am gonna let it dry on this cutting board and we'll see how that does today. To see if I get a more successful transfer, so it maybe won't wrinkle and release as much as it did when I just let it air dry. So we'll let it dry on this cutting board till this afternoon, and then I'll immerse it in water and show you the results. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second, just see if there are any questions. So Jerry, did I answer your question about the book pages or no?
Yes, you did. It sounds like I should make a photocopy first.
Great, I think that's a great idea. Okay, so before we go, we have 12 minutes. So I just want to show you this altered book example, just to give you some ideas about what could happen inside a book. And I just got some gesso on it today, so now it's especially altered. So I just did that today. So this is an old book, Hopalong Cassidy's Private War. So the pages are not in excellent shape, and so I had to be careful with them to make sure that I didn't destroy them. So I just use books like this as my example, so I can kind of keep all my technique ideas in one place. So I made this last year. That's not a transfer, that's just a black and white copy of my mom. So this is all family related. I used some acrylic spray paint here. And this is a packing tape transfer, which we'll do this afternoon. So this is an image of my dad that was a black and white photocopy that I used a packing tape transfer of. And underneath it, I primed it with acrylic paint and gesso. And I glued it on with gesso. So I'll show you that this afternoon. I'm looking for the transfers. Not all of these are transfers. It's just ink blots on my paper. This is just a photocopy I glued on and then altered. So here's that Citrasolv transfer I showed you a little earlier. I put gesso underneath it so that there would be a higher contrast between the text below and the black and white image on top. Okay. These are just altered photos with some ink, so they're not image transfers. Just flipping through and seeing what we got here. This guy, I've taken another piece from the altered book and put acrylic paint and put it on top of this page with ink on it. Kind of distressed it a little. Okay. It's just a photocopy with a window cut out. This is some gesso on the pages, so you could apply the gesso in specific places before you put another image transfer on top to obscure some part of the image. Moving it back down into the camera view. Here is an acetone transfer. So here's a little bit of matte medium, gesso on this page. And then I did an acetone transfer of half of a face right on top. She's just looking at the next page. So that's the acetone transfer we'll do this afternoon. I have a couple more transfers in here to show you. That's spray paint. So you can spray paint in an altered book. This is water-based spray paint, which has a much better archival quality than regular spray paint. It's just a photocopy of my mom and her twin brothers. Marbled paper. Trying to get to the last transfers here. Flip a little bit. So here's a washed out image. So I wanted this one to look a little ghost-like. So I did a Citrasolv transfer on top of a page that has some gesso behind it. So this was a black and white photocopy that I used Citrasolv to transfer it. It was a very heavily toned image. And so instead of a line drawing, it had a lot of toner on it. So it kind of created this more ghost-like image. Okay, so I think That's all the transfers I have in this book. Let me just see. Oh, one more. This one is a Citrasolv transfer on top of a piece of scrapbook paper that I also had acrylic paint on. So you can see the dark image on top of a highly patterned paper. I then highlighted with some white markers and ink to kind of make the Citrasolv transfer stand out better because it was tending to blend into the paper a little bit. This was a Humboldt Oil Camp, was a place where my dad grew up. Okay, I think that is all I have in this book. I'll show you this page because it's really satisfying. So this is just cut out pages with a nice shiny paint on it. Okay, I will stop sharing. Okay, what questions do you guys have before this afternoon session? Let's see, Denise has a question. I go over a method of transferring an image to fabric without gesso. Yes. So this afternoon, I will show you Citrasolv transfers onto fabric because that's my favorite one to go onto fabric. So I'll show you that one. And then the acetone, it tends to bleed on fabric, but I can show you that and show you kind of the problems with it. But I'll definitely show you the Citrasolv. Okay, other questions before you guys go have lunch? Can I suggest papers by name this afternoon? Yes, I have that on my list to find the name of those papers. How durable are fabric transfers? I'm always approaching everything with the idea that I'm not going to wash it. So that my approach is really art related and not like a quilt for use. However, if you heat set it, I'm told that it can withstand things, but I'm always using things just for art purposes and not meant to be washed again. However, I will say if you're interested in that, this is the book for you, Imagery on Fabric. There are so many options in here on how to transfer things onto fabric that can be used for clothing. So other things that I do like screen printing, stamping, dyeing, and other types of processes like fabric paint can all be washed if you just heat set them really well. Great question, Ellen. Anybody else? Mark, is there anything else we need to cover before we go today?
I don't think so. I just sent you a text with some information that people requested for later, but
Oh, great.
that's all we had.
Okay, perfect.
I have a-
definitely do
I have
that.
a quick question.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Can you hold that book up again that you just held up on imagery so I can take a screenshot?
You bet. Here you go.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, and this is on the resource list on the classroom site. So the books that I showed you, with the exception of the ones that were just images that I pulled from, they're all on the resource list on the website. Okay, guys. So we have a break until the afternoon session, and then I will show you the other 3 transfer methods, and I'll show you the follow-up from our drying transfers that we started this morning.